much to be here for, can you hear me? I think so. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm a little tall for this. Thank you very much. Is that better? All right, I have good friends that are keeping me on track. Thank you very much for being here for our first program of the season. And we cannot thank you enough for your support this year. I'd especially like to thank our trustees that have worked so hard, you know, and Barbara and Laura, but the trustees, if you'll stand please and be recognized, you guys. Emeritus Peter Smith, yeah, so, and also all our volunteers. And this is a wonderful program to kick off the season, and thank you very much for being here. And I'd also like to recognize our wonderful curator, Barbara Mkunis. And these programs would not be possible without our program manager, Laura Martin.
Just a quick introduction of the programs. These went out a little late this year. We had a little printing mishap, but hopefully you've all received one, and if not, we have some out there. They have our schedule of programs for the year, and after tonight's wonderful program about Eleanor Roosevelt, we are looking forward to the Old Country Fiddler next month. So we hope you can make that. That's a New Hampshire Humanities program. Also, our May program, looking way ahead, is listed as a location to be announced. That will be held at the Cooperative Middle School. So now you can fill in that piece of your calendar. So just a quick introduction of our speaker tonight. Michele Albion was raised in Maine, and this is in her own words, she was a history nerd from a young age. And many of us here can relate to that. She has a master's in museum studies earned from George Washington University, and she's worked at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Edison and Ford Winter Estates. And she is the author of several books, as you can see back in the corner there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michele.
Well, thank you for all coming out on this rainy night. Thank you to the board members, to Pam, to Laura, to Anne, to Vicki, and to Barbara. And this is not your grandmother's presentation. We're going to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. We're going to talk about what she said. And what she said gives insight into her soul. So we're going to start off by, what do we know about Eleanor Roosevelt? And yes, this is your opportunity to speak. What do we know about her? First Lady of the United States. How many terms did she serve as First Lady? Four. Has any other First Lady served 4 terms? No. What else do we know about Eleanor Roosevelt? She was married to FDR, who was her father's 5th cousin. So to her it was an advantage because the monograms on her towels did not change. All right, what else do we know about Eleanor Roosevelt? She spoke her mind in a time when women were not supposed to speak their minds. She did things that women were not supposed to do. She was born in 1882, and she had what can delicately be called a crappy childhood. Yeah. I was talking with somebody who said, oh, you know, she grew up with a silver spoon in her mouth. Yes, she did, but it was a poison spoon. Her mother called her ugly, and she died when Eleanor was very young. Her father was an alcoholic, and he was an opium addict who killed himself basically by jumping out of a sanitarium window. She had a baby brother who died when he was very young, and then she had to go live with her remaining brother with her grandmother. And Mary Ludlow Hall was I would call her an ogre. I mean, she was of the old school. She made Eleanor walk around with a stick in the back of her blouse so she would stand up straight. Eleanor was homeschooled, which today sounds wonderful, but for her was not, because she wasn't around other children. She was a lonely, lonely little girl. But all that changed because one of her aunts wanted her to go to this French-speaking boarding school called Allenswood in London. And in Allenswood, this ugly duckling, that's what her aunt, who was married to another president named, Theodore, called her an ugly duckling. But she said she might develop into a swan, and she did. She goes to Allenswood. She is under the influence of this woman named Madame Silvestri, and she just blooms. She's encouraged to think and to question. She's encouraged to entertain dangerous ideas. They travel around without the benefit of Baedeker, which is the travel book. It's like the Google Earth of their time. And she becomes sort of her own person. And you know, that's sort of where we're going to start tonight. We're going to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt and what she said. And if you have any questions, you don't have to wait like good little children until the end of the presentation. Give me a wave and ask right then and there. All right, so we're going to go on to our first slide. Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds discuss people. Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, this is why we have quote books like the Quotable Eleanor Roosevelt, which is available on the back table. Eleanor Roosevelt did not say this. It came from a quote by Henry Thomas Buckle in 1901, predated Eleanor. Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote. So, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a lot, she said a lot, she spoke on television, she spoke on the radio. So compiling a book of quotes was a labor of love and agony. It was my third quote book, and the first one that I actually was really excited about the topic. I have two sets of grandparents, and the decidedly WASP group thought that Eleanor was an abomination upon the soul and called her that woman. And the other side that was decidedly not so waspy reveled and adored her, and I swear my grandmother had a picture of FDR on the wall, though my mom says that she didn't. So with that in mind, I approached these letters and articles and newspapers, columns that she wrote, and tried to compile the quintessential Eleanor Roosevelt. The manuscript, which you can imagine was already trimmed down, started at 300 pages, and it's down to 120. So it breaks down into chapters, and the first chapter we're going to talk about is government and politics. All right, we talked about the fact that Eleanor's uncle was president. President who? You got it. But she was not really permitted to talk about politics and think about politics because it was unseemly as a woman until she got to that boarding school named Allenswood. In 1929, she starts to stand in for FDR because he can't go and speak out in public. And why would that be? Because he had polio. See, I love this crowd. They're readers, all of them. She works for the Women's Trade Union League, and they are advocating for some really radical ideas. The 48-hour work week, crazy. Minimum wage, and the end of child labor. She campaigns for Alfred E. Smith, who was running against her cousin. In 1933, she becomes First Lady. She does not want to be First Lady. She did not sign up for this. She was forlorn. She was miserable. But like all women who have an obstacle, she had to either be squashed by it or decide to rise above. Which do you think she did? Okay, so let's find out how she feels about politics. I feel rather sad about politics. There are so many out there who are for themselves and not for the good of the country in both parties. I know that you make no connections with And how does she feel about polls? I hate to see us put so much trust in polls as they don't represent reasoned thought. Would you like to lower your taxes? Yes. Would you like to have services like roads and hospitals? Yes. You can't have both without some compromise. She said, politics is the participation of the citizen in government. The kind of government he has depends entirely on the quality of that participation. So our government is because of who? Us. Us. If we're not involved, who's to blame? Us. She didn't want to get into politics. She didn't want to be first lady. But when FDR dies, she thinks her time is over, that she is going to recede into the background. In fact, she starts being the subject of advertising for typewriters and TWA airlines because she thinks nobody's going to care what she has to think. She said, Franklin's death ended a period of history, and now in its wake, those of us who laid in his shadow have to start again under our own momentum and wonder what we can achieve. Did she disappear? No. She became really rather pivotal in a little organization called the United Nations, right? She had really strong ideas about democracy. Somehow we must be able to show people that democracy is not about words, but action. She also had strong ideas about communism that changed over time. In the 1930s, she said, I am sure the more you study communism or socialism, the more tolerant you will feel. The best thing would be to travel to such countries and see for yourself. We are not afraid of a known situation. It is the unknown we fear. And then she did just that. She traveled around the world. She visited the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And she came up with a very different opinion. The evil of communism as it is developed in Europe is, of course, the same evil which existed in fascism and Nazism. In 1957, she went, whoop, did we miss one? Yep. I meant to say that that's her with Khrushchev. All right. Now we're going to talk about other nations. So Eleanor Roosevelt traveled a lot during World War II. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But she goes to Paris after the war. Now, Paris had been occupied by the Nazis. The Nazis had looted Paris of everything from artwork to butter, and the people were starving. Yet, the women still looked good. Nothing can down the Parisian woman chic. Her opinions on Israel changed. In 1945, she said, I do not happen to be a Zionist. But in 1958, she said, Israel is the one state in the whole Near East that understands the meaning of freedom and democracy. And yes, they put her on a stamp. Her opinion on Norwegians, I think, is adorable. The Norwegians don't give me much excitement, but they're nice to look at. She observed that the Soviets, oh no, you're right. You'll remember that after World War II, Great Britain still thought of itself as a superpower. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a very quiet and very secret advisor to President Truman, tried to explain that no, you are not the big cheese anymore. And this was one of her private musings. Great Britain is always anxious to have someone pull her chestnuts out of the fire. And though I'm very fond of the British individually, and like a great many of them, I do very much object to being used by them. All right, now we're going on to the Soviet Union. They have no freedom, we say, but they never had freedom, so they do not miss it. She had a lot of opinions about America. America is not a pile of goods, more luxury, more comforts, a better telephone system, a greater number of cars. America is a dream of greater justice and opportunity for the average man, and if we cannot obtain it, all of our other achievements amount to nothing at all. You are an American, whether your features are those of a Japanese, whether you are Italian or German ancestry, are born and bred in this country, or are naturalized. We are Americans all. In 1943, she went to Japanese internment camps. She felt that it was wrong for American citizens to be interned and said so. This was during the war, and by many it was considered traitorous. This next quote, I'd like you to remember that this was said in the 1950s, not the 1990s, not the aughts, and not today. A number of people still think of the United States as being overwhelmingly English, Protestant, and white. This erroneous idea influences their whole outlook. This is the 1950s, folks. All right, so World War II. Can FDR get around and visit the war front? No. Eleanor decides that she's going to go in his place. Only one problem. Nobody wants her out in the Pacific Theater. She talks to Admiral Halsey. Halsey says absolutely not. He does not want do-gooders out there. And he says, Guadalcanal is no place for you, ma'am. But Eleanor Roosevelt is nothing else if not persistent. She is really persistent. And she travels all over, not only Europe, but also through the Pacific. And at one point she lost like 40 pounds because she was moving so much and eating so little. And at the end of it, this is what Halsey said. She alone accomplished more good than any other person who had passed through my area. That's for somebody who called her a do-gooder and didn't want her. But when the 1930s came around, before all of this happened, Eleanor Roosevelt, like a whole lot of people, didn't want us to get entwined in another war. World War I was absolutely devastating to our economy, to our people, and we had that little thing called the Great Depression. Made us not too excited about getting into a war. So she says, if we do away with the war idea, one of the first steps would be to do away with all the possibility of profit. And I love this quote because one of the people who hated Eleanor Roosevelt most in the world said pretty much the same thing. He was Henry Ford. By the way, his books are in the back as well. They could agree on nothing else, but this they could agree on. But like a lot of Americans, Eleanor Roosevelt had mixed feelings about the war. Even though I can never quite rejoice in the loss of any human life, I can't help being happy each time we have a victory, knowing that if we destroy ships and supply bases and factories faster than the enemy replaces them, the war will be over that much more quickly. And I think that's the way most Americans felt at the time. She had no patience for segregation in the armed forces. I wish that out of this war might come to us a truer evaluation of the worth of human beings and far less interest in labels of race and religion. She felt war was a failure. War is the result of failures of human beings and not their successes. But she did feel like women should have a place in the war. Life in the armed services is hard and uncomfortable, but I think women can stand up under that type of living just as well as men. Like many Americans, she was relieved when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But as our nation began to become aware of what that actually meant, like a lot of Americans, she was really worried about what this would mean, not only for the United States, but for the world. The day we found the secret of the atomic bomb, we closed one phase of civilization and entered into another. And those of you who did duck and cover when you're in school, raise your hands. You know what that was like. How many of you were afraid that the Russians were going to invade? It really affected the American psyche. As early as 1939, in her My Day columns that she wrote for newspapers, Eleanor Roosevelt talked about what was going to be called the Holocaust. She talked about men and women and children who were displaced from all over Europe before it made national newspapers. At the end of the war, she said, "Something must have happened that we know nothing about to turn people who are highly educated and civilized into sadists who enjoy seeing other human beings suffer." But she had faith in peace. She said, "A breach of peace anywhere is a menace to peace everywhere. For it isn't enough to talk of peace, one must believe it, and it isn't enough to believe it, one must work at it." And that's exactly what she did in the United Nations. So Eleanor Roosevelt was a teacher, among other things. She taught at Todd Hunter School in New York from 1927 to 1933. And guess what? She taught history. And she told us something about the past. "I believe strongly that the past must never govern the future. I also believe that we must have the past in mind to help us shape the future." And she also said something about change. "All big changes in human history have arrived at slowly and through many compromises." What is she doing in this photograph? For those of you who can see it without my big head in the way. She's in the coal mines. She went to West Virginia to talk about the living conditions and the working conditions of miners. And she decided that she was going down in the mines. Her Secret Service men said, "No, ma'am, you are not going down in the mines. That's too dangerous." She said, "Precisely." So she donned a pair of overalls and one of the miner's caps, and she went down there and it made national newspapers. And I can't tell you how many newspapers decried her behavior as being unworthy of a first lady. It happened frequently during her service as first lady because she stepped out of the role. The first lady was supposed to serve tea, and she did that. But that was not the only thing she did. She also had some thoughts on religion. "How marvelously arrogant we all are in our use of the name of the Lord. Each one of us feeling sure that the Lord's with us proclaims the righteousness of his cause." But she had interesting ideas about school prayer. "But I've never been able to see why there was anything to prevent any school from opening with the Lord's Prayer and a hymn in exactly the same way as they salute the flag. There is no reason for fear in case a group does not believe in any religion. They can stay in the room. It doesn't do them any harm." As I mentioned, when FDR died, she thought, it's over. Nobody's going to care what I have to say anymore. And it certainly wasn't, because a certain president you might have heard of, Truman, said, "I'm starting this thing called the United Nations, and I would like you to be a part of it." She was the first delegate to the UN from 1945 to 1952. She was chair of the UN Commission of Human Rights from 47 to 51, and she was on the committee, but she was, you can tell by the language, one of the main authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it begins with, where after all do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Instead of talking about treatises and laws, she talked about humanity. Freedom is not really freedom unless you can differ in thought and an expression of your thought. Now, this gentleman right here is Westbrook Pegler. Has anybody ever heard of him?
Yes.
Yes. Who said yes? What? Tell me about him. Do you remember anything about him?
Well, his columns were very popular. He said things that people were surprised about. I mean, he didn't say very many nice things as I can remember. I was a kid at that.
Yeah.
I didn't read him.
So Eleanor Roosevelt and Westbrook Pegler often had opposing columns in newspapers. They'd be right across from each other. And he was like the anti-Eleanor Roosevelt. And he detested everything he could about her. In 1957, he said, "This woman is a political force of enormous ambitions. I believe she is a menace, unscrupulous as to the truth, vain and cynical, all with the pretense of exaggerated kindness and human feeling, which deceives millions of gullible persons." And she said about him, "The poor man needs to be able to say disagreeable things." So they had been sort of sniping at each other, more one-sided than two-sided, for years and years and years. And then she invited him to visit her in upstate New York. And as you can tell from this photograph, despite the fact that everything about her galled him to the core, he liked her. So freedom is being able to acknowledge that somebody who you find diametrically opposed to you is human and you can connect with them. With freedom also comes responsibility. Freedom makes a huge requirement of every human being. With freedom comes responsibility. For the person who is unwilling to grow up, the person who does not want to carry his own weight, this is a frightening prospect. Growing up, it's not for the sissies. She also did not believe in censorship. You'll know in the 1930s, the Hays Code, who remembers the Hays Code, governed what you could read in books, it governed movies, it said, you know, that's why, do you remember the show, what's the show with Dick Van Dyke? And, what's that?
Mary Tyler Moore.
Before Mary Tyler Moore, the show that, the Dick Van, thank you! Laura Petrie and Dick Van Dyke always had separate beds because of the Hays Code. You couldn't have a married couple. And also, nobody could be lying on the bed. You had to have 1 foot on the floor. But Eleanor Roosevelt opposed censorship. One thing is sure, none of the arts flourishes on censorship and repression, and by this time, it should be evident the American public is capable of doing its own censoring. Eleanor Roosevelt was a hard worker all of her life. She would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. She might go for a ride or a walk. She would spend the morning doing correspondence. She, over the course of the day, might give 3 or 4 speeches, might host several dinners, get home late in the evening, finish up her correspondence with her private secretary, maybe read a little bit or talk to a friend before she went to bed at 11 or 12 and do the same thing the next day, every day for years. She said it's not more vacation we need, it's more vocation. Now this next quote may blow you away. Comes from 1946, not 1966, not 1986, and not today. The silly idea that there is a division in housework seems to me foolish. The kind of man who thinks helping with the dishes is beneath him will also think that helping with the baby is beneath him, and then he certainly is not going to be a very successful father. 1946. She also was a believer in unions. The only thing that can be done to help any workers to obtain proper working conditions and get better wages is to organize. She was a big supporter of the arts and leisure. During the Depression, she went all out for artists, trying to make sure that they got programs and projects with the WPA, which stands for the Works Progress Administration. I love you guys. She believed in the power of the artist. Oh, that's her in a bathing suit. She wants to swim. That is the great power of the artist, the power to make people hear and understand through music, literature, or to paint something which we ordinary people feel but cannot reveal. During the course of her life, she wrote 27 books, over 8,000 columns, 550 or more articles, and 175,000 letters a year. Writing is an art, and like all art, it constantly dangles before you the chance to do better, and so you can never be bored. She was a big believer in education and learning. She visited a lot of schools during the course of her life. But she cautioned people about trying to control young minds. I think that we make a very serious mistake in education when we are terrified the minute anything is mentioned that we think might be a dangerous doctrine. It would be much better for youth to discuss any questions in the world today with older people so that they can have 2 points of view. And she practiced what she preached. Young people would come up to her at a rally and tell her that she didn't know what she was talking about, or older people, and she would invite them to the White House to talk with them. She would say, "Tell me what you think." And she would listen, and then she would explain her position with civility. Crazy idea, huh? She also believed in educating the whole child. Our interpretation of education must never be so narrow that we lose sight of the fact that learning to read on an empty stomach or with eyes that are overstrained because of lack of proper glasses is not real education. And she praised and applauded differences. Learning about other people does not mean that of necessity we must emulate them. It does mean one will have a better understanding of their motives and reactions, and therefore we will be better neighbors. This photograph, for those who I'm blocking, was taken in New Zealand. In New Zealand, this was the customary way of greeting people, rubbing noses. Who knew? This hit American newspapers, and as you can imagine, once again, the First Lady was considered undignified. Eleanor realized that education was the key to freedom, and that depriving people of education was the key to slavery. One of the best ways of enslaving people is to keep them from education. All right, so now let's talk about gender, age, and class. And this is a group of Girl Scouts with, Lowe, first name, Jennifer? Julia Lowe in Georgia. Thank you, see? All right. She said it is the person and not the sex that counts. But failures were easily ascribed to women. When a woman fails, it is much more serious than when a man fails, because the average person attributes the failure not to the individual, but to the fact that she is a woman. This happened to Eleanor more than once in her life. Does anybody know where this photograph comes from? Give you a hint, 1943.
Somewhere in the South.
No, ironically, somewhere in the North. Detroit, bing, give this woman a free membership. So in the 1920s, Detroit was a stronghold for the KKK. And you would think that that would have declined over the years, but when you had the great migration of Southern blacks moving to the big city, that didn't go well to the low-wage white workers. And so there was an uneasy and unenforced segregation. But in the 1940s, there was a public housing project that was being built in Detroit named for Sojourner Truth, who was an African-American abolitionist. Ain't I a woman, right? So this is named for a woman, a black woman, in Detroit. So Eleanor Roosevelt, among others, said, it should not be segregated. It should not only be for black people or white people. Anybody should be able to apply. And as a result of this, in 1943, you have the riot at Belle Island. You have 34 people killed. You have 17 blacks killed by police. And it was laid squarely at the feet of Eleanor Roosevelt. Our nation was not ready for this. Excuse me. And women who want to lead must stand up and be shot at. And by the way, she was a very good Marx person. Couldn't drive to save her life. She could drive, she just did not drive well. But she could hit a target all day long. But it was hard to be a woman in politics. A woman in public life needed to develop skin as tough as rhinoceros hide. Anybody a woman in politics today? Has that changed? A little bit better, I hope? Many of you will know that she had some personal challenges in her life. And this photograph might look familiar. She said, as a rule, women know not only what men know, but much that men will never know. For how many men really know the heart and soul of a woman? So over here we have FDR. Over here on the other side we have a very dour looking Eleanor Roosevelt. And who do we have in the middle? Lucy Mercer, later Lucy Mercer Rutherford. So Lucy was Eleanor's social secretary in 1914. In 1916 she starts working for FDR and they have an affair. And when FDR comes back from Europe in 1918, Eleanor, being the dutiful wife that she was, is unpacking his trunks. And what does she find? Love letters. And you know, I think if it had been one or two, if it had been a short-term thing, she would have been able to move on. But it wasn't. It was a long-term love affair that didn't end, that continued through the rest of his life. So Eleanor, being the modern woman that she was in many ways, offered FDR a divorce. And FDR was considering it. And keep in mind, I think at that point they had 4 kids, 4 or 5. But his mother, Sarah, says absolutely not, because what won't he be able to do? Become president, because Senator, his career is over. So they stay married, but after that time their marriage is very different. But this photograph was taken in the 1920s. Eleanor was well aware of what was going on and wasn't particularly appreciative of it. On a lighter note, she said almost always the male animal is the show-off, while female remains demure and is less strikingly clad. Perhaps someday we will have the courage to strike a good medium and let the men have a little self-expression in their clothes. Have we achieved that yet? Eleanor Roosevelt was a true American patriot and did not believe in the concept of royalty because they didn't earn anything. I find royalty heavy and boring. Royalty is a strain even when it is simple and stodgy. All right, now we're going to talk about race and ethnicity. So, she's in a plane. Does anybody know who she's in a plane with? One of the Tuskegee Airmen. Sorry. Tuskegee. 1941, Eleanor Roosevelt goes down to Tuskegee and says, hey, these male pilots need to be able to fly in the war. but they can't because they're African Americans. So she wants to show her confidence in these men as pilots. So she says, take me up. And her Secret Service men say, no, you're not going up in a plane with them. And she says, well, I am. So then they say, well, we'll go up with you. Two-seater. She says, no, I'm going up on my own. And she did. And it went across newspapers all over the country. And not too long after that, coincidence, I'm sure, the Tuskegee Airmen are allowed to fight in the war, and they come out more decorated than the average other citizen. Tolerance is not something Eleanor Roosevelt tolerates. I do not like the word tolerance. If you tolerate something, you do not like it very much. And in this case, she's visiting a group of Lebanese American students. Now, some of you might have heard of a little event having to do with the Daughters of the American Revolution. She became friends with Marian Anderson, who was a black opera singer, in 1935. And 3 years later, Howard University requested of the Daughters of the American Revolution that Marian Anderson be welcome to speak in their Constitution Hall. And this was a big deal because Constitution Hall was the largest public venue in DC, had 4,000 seats. And of course, DC is segregated at the time. So the DAR says no. Eleanor Roosevelt then resigns from her position at the DAR. To remain as a member implies approval of that action, and therefore I am resigning. She also arranges for a slightly larger venue for Marian Anderson. Courage. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the bravest people that I've ever studied. When asked, what would you do if someone tried to assassinate your husband, she said, why, I'd stand in front of him, of course. How many women in this room would say that? Courage belongs to no one race and no one religion. No racial prejudices are born in us. They are acquired as children. They are acquired as children live with adults who have prejudices, racial and religious. Okay, we're going to talk about humanity. In 1942, Eleanor Roosevelt goes to Great Britain. During the war, she tours 13 cities, goes everywhere from the East End to Buckingham Palace, and she is stunned and awed by the spirit of the British people. Even in our blackest moments, we have to acknowledge that there is something very fine in human beings. But she also recognized a few of our less desirable qualities. The more I observe human nature, the more I feel we are all of us perverse. In 1953, she goes to Japan. Human resources are the most valuable asset the world has. And she was absolutely courageous. Not only would she stand in front of her husband, but she stood up to the KKK, among others. In 1934, she was a proponent of the Wagner Antilynching Act. Lynching was rampant in the South, and she wanted it to stop. And so she advocated for this bill. Her husband opposed it, and it failed. In 1938, she went to Birmingham, Alabama to speak at the Southern Conference on Human Welfare. This was a segregated venue. She walked in and took down the line that was in between the two sets of chairs. And the Birmingham police came in and forced them to segregate, and they put her chair on the stage in front of the white section, and she moved her chair to the middle. She could have been arrested. And then when they broke out into sessions, she dragged her chair everywhere she went and sat in the middle of the room, in the middle of the group. So she effectively desegregated Birmingham before Birmingham was desegregated. In 1959, she received a bomb threat on June 16th for a speech that she was going to give in Montego, Tennessee. And this is the redacted document from her FBI file. By the way, her FBI file, because Hoover was not a big advocate of Eleanor Roosevelt, is in a file cabinet that's this high and that deep, all the way down and jam-packed full of documents. Courage is more exhilarating than fear, and in the long run it is easier. We do not have to become heroes overnight, just a step at a time, meeting each thing that comes up. Seeing it is not as dreadful as it appeared, discovering we have the strength to stare it down. She had a bomb threat, she attended. At one point, there was a $25,000 bounty on her head from the KKK. She never missed a venue. She said it is a brave thing to do, to have the courage to be an individual. It is also perhaps a lonely thing. But it is better than not being an individual, which is to be nobody at all. She, as you know, grew up in very unhappy circumstances, and she married a man whose mother did not particularly like her, which is probably the most tactful way of saying that. And this is actually a famous quote of Eleanor's that she actually did say. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Don't buy into it. Strength that goes wrong is even more dangerous than weakness that goes wrong. Does anybody know the woman she's with? Yes. Eleanor Roosevelt was not thrilled about having to meet with her. All right, and this is the last chapter we'll be talking about tonight. It's on emotions. I love this photograph. She looks angry. And in a lot of times, she had the right to be angry about different things. You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop and look fear in the face. And who is this lovely lady with Eleanor Roosevelt? Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart. So Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt became friends. And one evening, when Amelia Earhart was invited to the White House over dinner, Eleanor Roosevelt mentioned that someday she'd really like to go up in a plane. She'd never been. Amelia Earhart says, okay, let's make that happen. So the two of them drive up to Baltimore, and in a borrowed plane, they fly over the nation's capital in evening gowns and gloves and pearls. And Eleanor Roosevelt loved it and hit the ground and said to FDR, I'm getting my pilot's license. And FDR said, no, I'm sorry, I'm putting my foot down. She was a horrible driver. At Hyde Park, there are these huge pylons on either side of the driveway and plenty of space in between. And she hit them on a regular basis. So in this particular case, I think it was probably very good that he put his foot down. She said, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. And love was a very challenging emotion for her. Love is a queer thing, but it hurts, but it gives one so much more in return. Now, many of you who read the book of Blanche Wiesen Cook and another book about Lorena Hickok have been told that Eleanor Roosevelt was gay. Maybe, but I'm not convinced. So Lorena Hickok was one of her closest friends. And in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and a little bit in the 50s, they would travel together, they would do things together. Hick was a journalist, they were great friends. And they did things that today, if you did them, people would go, oh. When they were in a hotel, they would share a bed. They would occasionally hold hands and they'd peck on the cheek. Back in my grandmother's day, that's what you did with your friends. So could they have been? Maybe. Maybe not. I'm not convinced. Ken Burns is also not convinced, so. That's fascinating. All right, so I don't advocate in any way adultery. It would be wrong. She was a married woman. However, this is Earl Miller. Earl Miller was her bodyguard. And her friends would object and say that he took liberties, like he would put his hand on her knee or put his arm around her shoulder. And hubba hubba. If you see this man in a 1940s bathing suit, whether or not they were an item, the fact that she got a little attention there was a very good thing. And of course, there's FDR. So I'm going to leave it up to your imagination, any direction you'd like to go in. But it's good. She had so much antagonism in her life. She had a difficult marriage, difficult relationships with her children, difficult relationships with the press. I'd like to think that somebody loved her. All right, and to wrap it up, our last quote. What we should seek rather than gratitude or love is the respect of the world. And I think those who found her ideas abhorrent and those who celebrated her ideas would agree that that's exactly what she gave. She gave her gratitude, she gave her love, and she should have the respect of the world. And that is the end. All right, so who has a question, a comment, a complaint?
What do you think she would consider her greatest achievement?
What would be her greatest achievement? I would say the Declaration of Human Rights. It was, for its time, it was revolutionary that everybody in the world, not just a nation, would have the basic rights that we take for granted, would probably be her greatest accomplishment.
What was her relationship with her children?
What was her relationship with her children? Eleanor Roosevelt never had a role model for parenthood. And because of that, especially with her older children, she was not a particularly good parent. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know whether she should be friends with them or she should be a disciplinarian. On top of that, her mother-in-law undermined her every single action. When Eleanor and FDR got married, his mother, thankfully, very kindly gave them a townhouse in New York. A townhouse that was a duplex. A townhouse that was a duplex in which she removed all the walls. So they connected, and Sarah came in and came out, and would tell her children, I am their mother. I am your mother. She just gave birth to you. So she was undermined from the very beginning. She mothered the later children in the relationship better. But it was difficult, and I don't think she was a very good mother, frankly, but I don't think FDR was a very good father either, because both of them had other things going on, and the kids weren't the first priority.
When she got married, was it a real romance at the beginning?
Absolutely. When Eleanor and FDR first got married, it was a real romance. He proposed to her 3 years before he was allowed to marry. Sarah tried to throw every roadblock in the way, including sending him to Europe for a while. Here, cool off. And, up until 1918, when she found those letters, she thought that the sun rose and set on him, and he was very affectionate towards her. So you can imagine just how far her world crashed when she found out that he had this long-term affair.
What year did they marry?
What year did they marry? Let me grab my cheat sheet.
How long they were married?
Engaged in 1903 and married in 1905, and he of course dies in 45, so that's 40
So
years.
13 years into the marriage, he was having an affair, or less than 13.
Well, and not that it's okay, but it was not uncommon. And may not still be uncommon today in certain circles.
From your research, do you have any understanding how she made that transition, given her class, the region she grew up in, to being a principled supporter of equality in terms of races?
The question is, how is it that Eleanor Roosevelt, given her background, became such an advocate for tolerance, for acceptance of all kinds of different races? You know, there doesn't seem to be one pivotal moment, but I think having this childhood where she was inferior, both in the way that people treated her and the way she felt about herself, made her realize that other people felt that way for also no legitimate reason. But it's something, she worked in a settlement house when she came back from Europe from her boarding school days and was exposed to men, women, and children for all kinds of different races, you know, and did nursing, went into people's homes. So that broadened her horizons too. And when she was working in the settlement house before she married FDR, she would bring him with him and say, hey, this is what these people live like, which gave him an insight that he wouldn't otherwise have.
What did you think of Teddy Roosevelt and his presidency, just in general?
She idolized her uncle. But when his son wanted to run for political office, she was not in favor. She did not like Teddy Roosevelt Jr. at all. Right. Anybody else? Yeah.
Did they have any children that died young, or am I thinking about FDR? I mean Teddy's, right?
No, actually, you're right. FDR, they had Franklin Jr. who died, and then later on they had another child whom they named Franklin Jr. who survived. So yes, and that was very painful for her as well. She lost a baby brother, she lost one of her own children. You know, and in those days, you know, you didn't talk about it. There was no proper mourning. It was just something that, you know, they died, you moved on and had another one. So, you know, a lot of women subjugated that feeling. All right, last chance. Burning questions, you can speak to me afterwards. In the back, there are books. I have a credit card swaggy thing. And also, if you have a question you really didn't want to ask in front of everybody else, please come and talk to me. Also, there are bookmarks in the back. You don't have to get a book, you can get a bookmark. Yes. All right. So thank you so much for coming out on this rainy night. You're fabulous.